topic after a beautiful lecture. I changed slightly the title of my talk. This is The Crisis of the 1930s and Strauss's Rediscovery of Political Thought. My point of departure in this lecture is a shift of alliance in the early works of Leo Strauss in the 1930s, the period in which he left Germany for France before heading to England and finally to the US. This shift of alliance is from German Jews' imagined association with the Protestant cultural elite to Strauss's imagined Islamic Jewish association during the medieval period. It is also a shift from Kantian to Hobbesian philosophy. Strauss's intellectual shift of alliance was deeply linked to the traumatic 1930s, which led to World War II and the Shoah. My lecture today will be divided in two parts. In the first, I will present the main features of Strauss's shift of alliance, and in the second, I will critically evaluate this Straussian shift by confronting it with its immediate intellectual background, especially as represented by two intellectual figures who developed related models and were in direct contact with Strauss: Étienne Gilson, the great historian of medieval philosophy, and Louis Massignon, the great Arabic scholar. Strauss' shift of alliance can be traced in his early works through his transformation of a central conceptual motif in Hermann Cohen's thought. The motif in question is that of rapprochement or affinity, in German Annäherung or Verwandtschaft. In Cohen's famous 1915 war essay Deutschtum und Judentum, this motif refers to a certain affinity between Judaism and central concepts of the Lutheran Reformation. In the passage projected on the screen, you may see the Formulae Verwandtschaft von Juden mit Grundlegung der Reformation und die Annäherung an Prophetismus. Cohen delineates in this passage a dialectic movement of rapprochement. First, Luther's Reformation rediscovered a series of central features of biblical Judaism. Second, the rediscovery produced misunderstanding and tension between early modern Jews and Luther and his followers. Each side saw the proximity of the other, yet the dominant structuring of society by Christian religion did not allow the rapprochement of Judaism and German Lutheran Reformation. When in the 18th and 19th centuries, Reformation became primarily a religious background for the development of German culture and science, then the Jewish Protestant rapprochement could finally happen, bringing with it a new Judaism elaborated by German Jews who were active in German science and culture. Yet, 20th century history took a far less positive path than that envisioned in Cohen's idealistic narrative. In 1933, 18 years after Cohen's powerful formulation of the German-Jewish-Protestant alliance, World War I was lost, the Weimar Republic collapsed, and the Nazis seized power. At that time, Leo Strauss was a Rockefeller Research Fellow in Paris with no way back home. In a letter dated May 1933, and addressed to Karl Löwit, Strauss articulates his acceptance of his exile from Germany. He also adds a swift but cogent expression of his intellectual and political shift of alliance. I see no acceptable possibility to live under the swastika, i.e. under a symbol that says nothing else to me except you and your kind are subhuman fusei and therefore true pariahs. There exists here only one solution. We must repeatedly say to ourselves, we men of science. For so people like us called ourselves during the Arab Middle Ages. Confronted with his exclusion as a Jew by the Nazis, Strauss initiates, or rather accelerates, an existential quest, replacing Cohen's failed Jewish-Protestant alliance with a model retrieved from the past. The medieval Jewish-Arabic or Jewish-Islamic alliance, which seemed in 1933 more appealing to Strauss than, I quote, the ridiculous and pitiful appeal to the droit imprescriptible de l'homme, human rights, as he writes in the same letter. Far from forcing him to embrace liberalism, Strauss's 1933 exile from Germany led him to seek a stable philosophical and historical axis in the attitude of Arab men of science, an attitude shared by Jewish philosophers in the medieval Islamic era, but unfortunately abandoned in the modern period. This imaginative and intellectual shift of alliance enabled Strauss to face the nearing catastrophe for German Jewry from an old new position, renewing the present signification of Jewish and Islamic philosophy as clearly expressed in his 1935 book, Philosophie und Gesetz. I'm quoting the end of this passage. If one considered that modern enlightenment, as opposed to medieval, generally publicize its teaching, one will not object to the assertion that the medieval enlightenment was essentially esoteric, while the modern enlightenment was essentially exoteric. In the first years of his exile from Germany, Strauss learned from the collapse of German political institutions linked to the Aufklärung the political value of esoteric medieval enlightenment. Inverting Cohen's historical narrative, Strauss was particularly prone to decipher in the Jewish-Protestant alliance crafted in the Age of Enlightenment and 19th century positive science, not a historical rapprochement impossible in earlier times when religion ruled, but on the contrary, the degeneration of an earlier and more successful model, the Jewish-Islamic political model, which articulated accepted religious norm and the classical philosophical drive toward perfection. Such degeneration could only lead, according to Strauss' newly invented historical vision, from the more stable medieval Enlightenment to the short-lived modern Enlightenment. In his Hobbes' Politische Wissenschaft in ihrer Genesis, Strauss, written in 1936, Strauss added a deliberate preference for Hobbes' political philosophy over that of German thinkers like Kant to his turning upside down of the history of medieval and modern Aufklärung. In his monography, he presents Hobbes' political philosophy as, I quote, the first peculiar modern attempt to give a coherent and exhaustive answer to the questions of man's right life, which is at the same time the question of the right order of society, end of quote. He explains the reason of his choice as follows. Thus, not the naturalistic antithesis of morally indifferent animal appetite on the one hand, and morally indifferent striving after self-preservation on the other, but the moral and humanist antithesis of fundamentally unjust vanity and fundamentally just fear of violent death is the basis of Hobbes' political philosophy. It will be objected that this moral antithesis is to be found in Hobbes' political philosophy only because Hobbes has not yet completely freed himself from the influence of the Christian biblical tradition. For what is the antithesis between vanity and fear of violent death, if not the secularized form of the traditional antithesis between spiritual pride and fear of God? A secularized form which results from the Almighty God having been replaced by the overmighty enemies and then by the overmighty state, the mortal God. This could be also added to your lecture. Hobbes succeeded reformulating the questions of man's right life by recasting the traditional antithesis between spiritual pride and fear of God in a more secular form of an antithesis between vanity and fear of violent death. Thus he escaped the danger of a completely naturalistic political philosophy which equates, as in the work of Spinoza and his heir, might with right. By choosing Hobbes over Spinoza, Strauss was not only adding a British flavor to his Jewish-Islamic model, but also pointing out the Achilles heel of modern Enlightenment thought, its failure to conceptualize a summum bonum or a summum malum for human passions, and to articulate such a concept in the political and social realms. This incapacity defined 19th century and early 20th century politics for Strauss and led to the catastrophe of 1933. Hobbes, and perhaps the British monarchy and empire with him, appeared to the exiled Strauss as a moment of equilibrium between the medieval theopolitical tradition and the rise of the modern state and modern enlightenment. To summarize my claim of a shift of alliance, we can say that the dramatic changes of the 1930s triggered for Strauss a dual nostalgia, or return to the medieval Jewish-Islamic model and to the pre-Enlightenment Hobbesian moment. This dual nostalgia is presented by Strauss as a moment of rebirth or return to political thought, both in Jewish and Western broader sense. Having highlighted some of the more salient aspects of Strauss' reaction to the crisis of the 1930s, I would like to explore its intellectual background, thus shedding new and critical light on Strauss' shift of alliance and his renewal of Jewish and Western political thought. This intellectual background of Strauss's evolution can be partly reconstructed from a letter Strauss addressed to his friend Karl Löwit in November 1932, upon his arrival in Paris. In this letter he writes, "I met two extraordinary men, both obviously not philosophers, the geographer André Siegfried and the Arabic scholar Louis Massignon, a burning soul, incredibly learned, gifted with a remarkable capacity to penetrate in the art of the questions. Etienne Gilson is not here. He is giving a series of lectures in Canada. Alexandre Coiré is a jolly fellow." This letter provides much information about the intellectual circle in which Strauss was moving. André Siegfried, Louis Massignon, and Etienne Gilson were three professors at the Collège de France, the highest academic institution in France. Alexandre Coiré was one of Gilson's most brilliant students. In this lecture, I will focus especially on two great French intellectual figures mentioned in the letter, Etienne Gilson and Louis Massignon. In the remaining time, I shall confront Strauss' medieval model with Gilson's and Strauss' Islamic Jewish model with Massignon's Islamic Catholic model. In an unpublished letter to Gilson, dated May 33, Strauss refers to an earlier meeting with the great professor and scholar of medieval philosophy, during which he writes, "I had the opportunity to explain to you," meaning Gilson, "my ideas on political science of Hobbes and its historical origin." Strauss continues by acknowledging that the objection you raised, meaning Gilson, helped me a lot. He hoped to compensate for his limited ability to defend his position in French by sending Gilson his first book in German, Die Religionskritik Spinozas, and referring to two passages in the book in which he defended his view on Hobbes. In these two passages, Strauss insists on the different attitudes of Hobbes and Spinoza vis-à-vis the basic modern political attitude, the conservation of oneself, Selbsterhaltung, which came to replace the Christian medieval quest for the summum bonum. For Strauss, Spinoza's political philosophy equates right with might and is therefore constrained by the dichotomy of the mob driven by affect opposed to a philosopher immersed in theory, resulting in the failure to find a common good that transcends might and affect. In sharp contrast, Hobbes succeeds in founding a modern state in the rational and moral decision of the individual and the collective to protect themselves from civil war. Here is the quotation, but I skip it for reason of time. This was what Strauss wanted to add to his earlier conversation with Gilson. Nonetheless, it is strange to read that the conversation between Strauss and Gilson revolved around Hobbes, while Strauss was developing at the same time his own philosophical reappraisal of Islamic Jewish medieval philosophy. This project was apparently much more connected to Gilson's monumental endeavor to unearth Christian medieval philosophy as a model for a contemporary Christian philosophy. In Christianisme et Philosophie, published in 1936, Gilson delineates the larger rationale of his project in the following way. To be an effective apologist, one must be first a theologian. I would even say, as much as possible, an excellent theologian. The thing is rarer than you think. There will be scandalized by it only those who speak of theology only by hearsay, or are content to recite its formula without having taken the time to deepen its meaning. But if one wants to do apologetics through science, it is not enough to be an excellent theologian, one must be an excellent scholar. The same is true of philosophy. It is deluding oneself to believe that one is serving God by learning a certain number of formula which say that one knows must be said without understanding why what they say is true. Gilson understood his monumental program of research in medieval philosophy as a complete renewal of Catholic apologetics and theology on a scientific and historical ground, whereas contemporary 19th century and early 20th century Catholicism had degenerated to a mechanical and anti-modern set of doctrines. Diving into the history of medieval philosophy would allow Gilson to rediscover the historical possibility of a Christian philosophy, which he defined as follows in his 1932 L'Esprit de la philosophie médiévale. This effort of believed truth to transform himself in known truth is truly the life of Christian wisdom, and the body of rational truth resulting from this Christian philosophy itself. Thus, the content of Christian philosophy is that body of rational truths discovered, explored, or simply safeguarded thanks to the help that reason receives from revelation. This passage may explain why Strauss was not interested in discussing his own understanding of Islamic and Jewish medieval philosophy with Gilson. While Gilson's research in medieval philosophy arose from a quest for a new Christian philosophy, Strauss's research was not designed to develop a Jewish philosophy, but only to retrieve the political, esoteric setting of Jewish and Islamic philosophical medieval practice as a counter-model to the present failure of enlightenment. In his book, Philosophie und Gesetz, Strauss defends the thesis that Plato's approximation to the revelation furnishes the medieval thinker with a starting point from which they could understand the revelation philosophically. With this formulation, he refers to the political medieval articulation of an Islamic or Jewish recognition of the authority of revelation with its philosophical elaboration, as a counter-model to the failure of modern Aufklärung. Strauss seems more interested in the Islamic Jewish political setting of the divine law, which integrated an esoteric philosophical practice within the common acceptance of Sharia or Halakha, than with the actual content of Islamic and Jewish philosophy. As for Christian medieval philosophy, Strauss, in contrast to Gilson, saw in it a danger rather than an opportunity for philosophy. In his article on Abravanel's philosophical tendency and political teaching, 1937, Strauss denigrates Abravanel's intellectual contribution for following the Christian teachings of the Middle Ages. This makes clear what Strauss thought of medieval Christian philosophy and of Gilson's project. If the confrontation of Strauss's medieval project with Gilson's revealed a rather formal and limited interest in medieval religious philosophy, comparing Strauss' Islamic Jewish model with Louis Massignon's Islamic Catholic one, unveils similar problems. Louis Massignon shared many of Gilson's aspirations to renovate Catholicism. Leading Catholic intellectuals like Maritain, Henri de Lubac, or Maurice Blondel felt the need to renovate, if not save, Catholicism from inner degeneration and external challenges by rediscovering an appealing meaning for Catholicism. In contrast to the great medieval historian, Massignon did not dig into the Christian medieval past, but rediscovered the possibility of Christianity through physical and spiritual encounter with Islam, with Muslims, with the Orient and the Maghreb in the first decades of the 20th century. To briefly introduce these psychological and spiritual encounter, I shall refer to an article by Massignon, in which he described this Catholic Islamic encounter by discussing one of his spiritual masters. Charles de Foucault, a French colonial explorer who went through a deep process of conversion in the Levant and the Maghreb. Describing Foucault's encounter with the disciple of a Muslim mystic, Massignon explained, "Before the spiritual reflection of Sheikh Bey deep in the soul of his disciple, Mus'ak Amastan, the wild mystic that was Foucault felt a force of the same metal, that it was a question of outclassing in spiritual perfection. Encountering vivid faith and religious spirit in a Muslim provoked in Charles de Foucault and later in Louis Massignon a dual psychological movement of identification and emulation. Through this, the religious authenticity of the colonized became an object of nostalgia for the colonizer, launching in the colonizer a revival of his ancient Catholic faith, which was nourished time and again by physical and spiritual encounter with the Orient and Islam. This movement of identification, emulation with the Muslim was for Charles de Foucault and Louis Massignon, but also for Strauss, a way to confront and redress the cultural and religious challenges of modern Europe. On a scholarly level, this attitude of identification, emulation led Massignon to a gigantic oeuvre dealing with Islamology, the history of geography of the Middle East and North Africa, and Arabic and Semitic linguistics, which revolved around his fascination with early Islamic mysticism, and especially with the heretic mystic of Al-Hallaj. I would like to present an early article by Massignon that clearly shows how the study of Islamic mystics could spur a new understanding of Christianity. In 1914, Massignon published in Der Islam an article about the famous heretic saying of Hallaj, Ana al-Haq, I am the truth. In the first lines of the article, Massignon quotes this saying, I am the truth, adding a strange formula, certainly, where vibrates like an echo of certain loggia of Jesus. Hallaj heretic saying is an echo of Jesus' words. This exemplifies how Massignon moved from the level of the personal encounter with the Muslim to that of a spiritual and intellectual encounter with Islam. He explained in the following passage, the Hallajian vocabulary expressly designates in al-Haq the pure divine essence, the creative substance, as opposed to creation, to al-Khalq. And now, how to explain that after isolating by definition al-Haq, the pure essence, from all logical contact with created things, Al-Hallaj dares to put it in verbal connection with his self, Ana, as a creature. Beyond the personal encounter of the Catholic and the Muslim, beyond the literary echo of Jesus in Hallaj's formula, Massignon discovered in Hallaj mysticism a source for understanding the whole process of incarnation, of the transcendent divinity, not only in Jesus, but also in the Semitic faith from Abraham to the later Muslim mystics. If we juxtapose Strauss' Islamic Jewish model with Massignon Islamic Catholic model, we may clearly find similarities. Both scholars find in Islamic philosophy or mysticism an answer to their Jewish and Catholic concerns. How to philosophize as a Jew after the collapse of German Aufklärung, or how to reintegrate Christ's incarnation into a Semitic continuum that ranges from Judaism to Islam, a move that could be an answer both to European and Oriental crises. Yet the differences between Massignon and Strauss are also clear. If Massignon devoted his whole academic, public and personal life to the Christian-Islamic encounter at all levels, religious, scientific and political, no similar commitment to Jewish-Islamic or Jewish-Arab collaboration can be found in Strauss's life and work. The Jewish-Islamic model designed by Strauss constitutes more a political and cultural counter-model to the failure of Jewish emancipation than it does any deep commitment to the Jewish and Islamic question, especially in the Levant, as we will see now. So I will just finish the last part of my talk without reading because of time. My claim is that we can see both in the by the confrontation with Gilson and with Massignon that the medieval and Jewish Islamic model developed by Strauss is formal in the sense that it is not really interested in the religious content of medieval philosophy, and is formal also in this Islamic Jewish encounter, in the sense that it is only interested in the political setting and not in the real encounter between the two. And this is all the more regrettable that because the geopolitical question of the Levant, the Islamic and Jewish question in the Levant, was very near to the question that was at the heart of Strauss's concern. Indeed, the evolution from the reforms of the Ottoman empires to Arab and Jewish nationalism raised the question of the liberal shift from confessional communities into something that would be beyond this confessional community commitment. And there was quite a range of philosophers and theologians in the Levant that were raising questions about the validity and the possibility of this move. And Strauss had no interest, no connection to it, although he had much information, at least with Paul Krauss about it, and surely with Massignon, who was very much involved. And in that sense, one is left with the feeling that from all his shift of alliance, the only figure that is really not formal is Hobbes. Hobbes is this is the heart of his political move, and the medieval and Jewish Islamic aspect is more of a way to protect philosophical practice in the tormented West of the 30s and the 40s. Thank you very much.